During the last weeks of January, Soviet patrols probed the Mannerheim Line, identifying the location of bunkers, and even bringing back pieces of concrete for analysis. On the 1st of February, Northwestern Front's artillery opened up, pumping 300,000 shells into Finnish positions in the first 24 hours. In the Suma sector alone, 400 shells per minute rained on Finnish positions. Under this crushing bombardment, some of the Finnish fortifications began to crumble. By the 10th of February, the Soviets were attacking all along the line, forcing the Finns into a battle of attrition they could not win. To the alarm of the defenders, Finnish batteries were no longer responding to Russian shelling. The Finns were running out of ammunition, and battery commanders were now under strict orders not to fire, except in cases of dire emergency. Finnish soldiers watched with frustration as masses of Russian infantry deployed to their front, and their guns remained silent. They now had to rely on machine guns, rifles and mortars to prevent a breakthrough. But still, the Mannerheim Line held. The Russians attempted to outflank the line by sending columns across the ice of the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. Finnish coastal batteries sent armor-piercing shells smashing into the frozen surface. Airbursts of shrapnel tore through the Soviet ranks, pushing them to flee across the fractured ice, where many hundreds drowned. On the 12th of February, a thick fog blanketed the Gulf of Finland. The Russians, advancing under its cover, got to within 50 meters of the Finnish shore when the fog lifted and the defenders' machine guns cut them down in heaps. The Finns still had astonishing successes, but Soviet numbers began to tell. By the second week in February, Finnish reinforcements consisted mainly of 16-year-old boys and reservists in their mid-50s. On the 14th of February, casualties in the Suma sector reached crisis point, and Mannerheim authorized a withdrawal. But with Suma gone, the remainder of the front was no longer viable. At 1600 hours on the 15th of February, Mannerheim ordered a general retreat back to an intermediate line, which was much less fortified. There were only two things which could save Finland: the spring and the intervention of foreign powers, particularly Britain and France. Unfortunately, the winter of 1939-40 was one of the coldest and longest of the 20th century. Foreign intervention was proving as illusory as the spring. Some foreign help had arrived, but it was in the form of semi-trained companies and battalions of idealistic volunteers, mainly from Sweden, but with contingents from many other European countries and the United States. On the 29th of February, Finnish diplomats had been on the point of accepting new Russian demands when an urgent message arrived from Paris. The French government urged Finland to fight on and promised the immediate dispatch of 50,000 troops and 100 bombers. On the strength of this promise, the Finns rejected Moscow's offer. But the French offer was dependent on the cooperation of Great Britain, and while Britain wished to send forces to Norway and Sweden to interfere with Germany's supplies of iron ore, London was not necessarily interested in going to Finland to fight the Russians. In addition, any Anglo-French intervention force destined for Finland was going to have to get the permission of the Norwegian and Swedish governments to cross their territory, and this was something Oslo and Stockholm were not prepared to allow. Finland made a desperate appeal to Norway and Sweden to open their borders, knowing that the appeal would be rejected. Finnish diplomats had already decided they had no choice other than to accede to Russian demands, and on the 13th of March signed a ceasefire in Moscow, which gave Stalin everything he had wanted. The Russo-Finnish War had lasted just 105 days. Finland had lost 25,000 dead and 43,500 wounded, out of a total population of fewer than 4 million. The Soviet losses were much greater, at least 250,000 dead and about the same number wounded. The Finns took 5,000 Russian prisoners, a surprisingly low number that says much about the severity of the fighting. Though Finland had had to bow to the inevitable, she had earned a reputation as a formidable small power, a nation not to be meddled with. Conversely, even though the Soviets eventually succeeded, the reputation of the Soviet army as a fighting force had been destroyed. American and British observers rated the USSR as a third-rate military power, a hapless giant incapable of defending itself. So too did the Germans. In fact, in April 1940, the Supreme Military Soviet met to sift through the lessons of the war and push through a program of radical reform. It was just in time.